Good evening, all, and welcome back to Spirits of Sites. What you're about to hear are not urban legends. These are not creepypasta stories written for entertainment. These are 5 true horror stories that happened in small Canadian towns, places where people thought they were safe, where neighbors knew each other's names, where evil was the last thing anyone expected to find. From serial killers hiding in plain sight to massacres that shocked the nation, these stories will disturb you, haunt you, and remind you that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are real. Before we begin, if you're a fan of true crime and disturbing real stories, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the darkest corners of true crime. And if you make it through all 5 stories, leave a comment telling me which one disturbed you the most. Now, let's get into it, but be warned, these stories are not for the faint of heart. They call it the Highway of Tears, 719 kilometers of asphalt stretching from Prince George to Prince Rupert in British Columbia. To most travelers, it's just another scenic route through the Canadian wilderness. But to the families of the missing and murdered, it's a graveyard without headstones, a place where their loved ones simply vanished into the forest, never to return. Since 1969, at least 18 women have disappeared or been found murdered along this desolate stretch of Highway 16. But that's the official number, the one the police acknowledge. Indigenous communities tell a different story. They say the real number is closer to 50. 50 mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends who set out on a journey they would never complete. The highway cuts through some of the most remote territory in British Columbia. Dense forests line both sides of the road, broken only occasionally by small towns barely clinging to existence. For many Indigenous women living in these isolated communities, hitchhiking isn't just convenient, it's necessary. Public transportation is virtually non-existent. If you need to get to the next town for work, for medical care, to visit family, you either have your own vehicle or you stick out your thumb and hope for the best. But hope has proven to be a dangerous commodity on the Highway of Tears. The first known victim was Gloria Moody, who vanished in 1969. She was never found. Then came Micheline Pear in 1974. Gail Ways disappeared in 1973, and her body was discovered in 1974. One by one, the victims accumulated. Delphine Nicole, Ramona Wilson, Roxanne Tiara, Alicia Germain, Lana Derrick. The names form a litany of loss, each one representing a life cut short, a family shattered, a community traumatized. What makes the Highway of Tears particularly horrifying is the pattern of neglect that allowed it to continue for decades. Many of the victims were Indigenous women, and their disappearances didn't generate the media attention or police resources that might have been mobilized for other victims. Families begged for help. They organized their own search parties, plastered missing person posters along the highway, held vigils and protests. But for years, their pleas seemed to fall on deaf ears. The RCMP maintains that there's no evidence of a single serial killer responsible for all the disappearances. They may be right. The sheer span of time, the slight variations in method, the geographic spread along such a long stretch of highway all suggest that multiple perpetrators have used this isolated route as their hunting ground. In a way, that's even more terrifying. It means the Highway of Tears isn't the work of one monster, but of many, each one taking advantage of vulnerable women traveling alone through the wilderness. In 2014, one of those monsters was finally caught. Cody Leijbokoff, a seemingly ordinary young man from Prince George, was convicted of murdering 4 people in the area. 3 of his victims were women whose deaths were linked to the Highway of Tears. Leijbokoff was only 24 when he was caught, which means he had been killing since his late teens. During his trial, evidence emerged that painted a picture of a sadistic killer who hunted women like animals, viewing them as nothing more than prey. Leijbokoff's youngest victim was 15-year-old Lauren Leslie, a beautiful girl with her whole life ahead of her. He lured her into his truck, drove her to a remote logging road, and murdered her with a pipe wrench. When hunters discovered her body, she had been so badly beaten that she was almost unrecognizable. The other victims, Jill Stuchenko, Cynthia Moss, and Natasha Montgomery, suffered similarly brutal fates. But even with Legebokoff behind bars, the disappearances haven't stopped. In 2012, Madison Scott vanished after a party near Vanderhoof, not far from Highway 16. She's never been found. In 2017, human remains discovered near Highway 16 were identified as Colleen McMillan, who had been missing since 1974. The highway keeps claiming victims, keeps hiding bodies in its vast wilderness, keeps breaking hearts. The indigenous communities along the highway have tried everything to protect their women. They've set up safe houses, organized shuttle services, created buddy systems for hitchhikers. Some communities have erected billboards featuring the faces of the missing women, reminding travelers that real people have disappeared here, that this isn't just a statistic, but a human tragedy playing out in slow motion. In 2006, a symposium brought together families of the victims, indigenous leaders, and law enforcement to discuss the crisis. It took 37 years and countless deaths for such a meeting to occur. The RCMP finally began Project EPANA, a coordinated investigation into the highway murders. But by then, so much time had passed that evidence had degraded, witnesses had died or moved away, and memories had faded. The chances of solving many of these cases had diminished to nearly zero. What haunts investigators and families alike is the knowledge that someone out there knows what happened. The killers know. And in some cases, other people know too. There have been rumors over the years of logging truck drivers who picked up hitchhikers and assaulted them. Rumors of parties in remote camps where women were plied with drugs and alcohol and never seen again. Rumors of a culture of violence and exploitation that treats indigenous women as disposable. The Highway of Tears represents something larger than just a series of murders. It's a symbol of the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered indigenous women and girls in Canada. It's a reminder that in the 21st century, in a wealthy, developed nation, some lives are still valued less than others. It's proof that when society decides certain people don't matter, predators notice, and they act accordingly. Today, if you drive Highway 16, you'll see the warning signs. They're bright and impossible to miss, advising hitchhikers not to travel alone, encouraging drivers to report suspicious behavior. But signs can't bring back the dead. They can't heal the wounds of families who still don't know where their daughters are buried. They can't erase the decades of neglect that allowed this tragedy to unfold. The highway still winds through the wilderness, indifferent to the suffering it has witnessed. The forests still keep their secrets. And somewhere out there, the perpetrators likely still drive these roads, remembering what they did, knowing they might never be caught, perhaps even planning to do it again. The Highway of Tears continues to flow, and the tears continue to fall, and the empty spaces at dinner tables in small towns across British Columbia remain unfilled. This is the legacy of indifference. This is what happens when we decide some lives matter less than others. This is the price paid by the most vulnerable among us, and it's a price that keeps being extracted year after year along a stretch of highway that refuses to give up its dead. He was the epitome of success, the golden boy who had done everything right. Colonel Russell Williams stood at the pinnacle of military achievement, commanding Canadian Forces Base Trenton, one of the country's busiest Air Force bases. He had flown prime ministers and royalty. He was trusted, respected, admired. When he walked through the base in his uniform, people snapped to attention. When he spoke, subordinates listened. He was the kind of man parents pointed to as an example for their children. He was the kind of man who seemed incapable of wrong. But inside the colonel's mind, in the dark spaces where no one could see, something else entirely was growing. It started small, as these things always do. A fantasy, a curiosity, a thought that most people would dismiss, but that Russell Williams nurtured like a dark seed in fertile soil. He began breaking into homes in the neighborhoods near the base. At first, he just wanted to look around, to invade the private spaces of others, to touch their belongings without permission. It gave him a thrill, a sense of power and control that his military rank couldn't provide. But looking wasn't enough for long. It never is for men like Russell Williams. He began stealing underwear, women's underwear specifically. He would break into homes while the occupants were sleeping or away, carefully select items from their dresser drawers, and take them home like trophies. He photographed himself wearing them, creating a secret catalog of his crimes, images he could revisit whenever he wanted to relive that feeling of violation and control. Between 2007 and 2010, Williams broke into homes 82 times, 82 separate invasions, 82 nights when someone's sense of safety was shattered, even if they didn't know it yet. He was methodical, careful, patient. He learned the patterns of his victims. He knew when they would be home and when they would be gone. He studied them the way a predator studies prey. And then the line that separates fantasy from action, voyeurism from violence, finally disintegrated completely. On September 26, 2009, Williams broke into the home of a young woman near Tweed, Ontario. But this time, he didn't just want her underwear, he wanted her. He tied her up, blindfolded her, and sexually assaulted her for hours, photographing and videotaping the entire ordeal. When he was done, he warned her not to go to police, threatened her, and left her traumatized and terrified. 3 weeks later, he did it again. Another young woman, another home invasion, another brutal sexual assault documented in photographs and video. But rape, it seemed, wasn't enough either. The darkness inside Russell Williams demanded more. It demanded the ultimate expression of power. It demanded death. On November 23, 2009, Williams made his way to the Brighton, Ontario home of Corporal Marie-France Como, a 37-year-old military flight attendant who served under his command at CFB Trenton. He knew her. She knew him. She trusted him as her commanding officer. That trust made her the perfect victim. Williams broke into her home after she returned from work. He waited for her, hiding in the darkness like a spider in its web. When she discovered him, the terror must have been overwhelming. This was her commander, a man she saluted, a man she respected, and he had come to kill her. Williams bound her with duct tape and rope. He photographed her. He tortured her. And then, methodically and without mercy, he killed her, suffocating her with duct tape over her nose and mouth. Before he left, he took souvenirs, more underwear to add to his growing collection, more photographs to add to his secret archive of depravity. For weeks, Williams continued his duties at CFB Trenton. He attended meetings. He gave orders. He represented the Canadian forces at official functions. All while Marie-France Comeau's body lay undiscovered in her home. All while her family wondered why she wasn't returning their calls. All while her colleagues assumed she was simply taking a few days off. On January 28, 2010, Williams struck again. This time, his victim was Jessica Lloyd, a 27-year-old woman from Belleville. He had been watching her house, stalking her, planning his attack. He broke in while she slept, and for hours, he tortured and assaulted her while documenting everything with his camera. He forced her to pose. He made her complicit in the photography of her own torture. And then, when he had satisfied whatever dark urge drove him, he killed her. But Williams made a mistake. In his arrogance, in his certainty that he was too smart to be caught, he drove his SUV past a police checkpoint near Jessica Lloyd's house. Investigators were canvassing the area looking for suspicious vehicles. They took down his license plate number as a matter of routine. When Jessica Lloyd's body was found a week later, hidden on a rural property, investigators began the painstaking process of checking every vehicle that had been near her home around the time of her disappearance. The list included hundreds of vehicles, but one stood out. The SUV registered to Colonel Russell Williams, commander of CFB Trenton. On February 7, 2010, 2 Ontario provincial police detectives asked Williams to come to their office for a routine interview. He agreed, probably confident that he could talk his way out of any suspicion. After all, he was a colonel. He was important. He was above suspicion, But Detective Sergeant Jim Smith was very good at his job. For 9 hours, he slowly, methodically, patiently dismantled Russell Williams's facade. He presented evidence. He asked questions. He waited. And gradually, Williams realized that the game was over. The mask he had worn for so long, the persona of the perfect officer, could no longer be maintained. Williams confessed, not just to Jessica Lloyd's murder, but to everything. The break-ins, the stolen underwear, the sexual assaults, the murder of Marie France Camoo. He led police to where he had hidden Jessica Lloyd's body. "Daughter!" He told them where they could find his collection of photographs and videos, thousands of images documenting his crimes in horrifying detail. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Williams's depravity. Police found his secret storage room, filled with stolen underwear organized by victim. They found his computer, loaded with photographs and videos. They found his journals, where he had documented his fantasies and planned his crimes. The man who had seemed so perfect, so controlled, so successful, was revealed to be a monster who had been hiding in plain sight. During his trial, some of the photographs were shown in court. Hardened police officers wept. The families of his victims were destroyed all over again, seeing the evidence of what their loved ones had endured. Williams himself showed no emotion, sitting in the prisoner's box as image after image revealed his true nature. The question that haunted everyone was simple and unanswerable. How? How does a man rise to such heights while harboring such darkness? How does someone lead double lives so completely that no one, not even his wife, suspected anything? How does a respected military officer become a serial rapist and killer? There are no good answers. Russell Williams was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. His rank and decorations were stripped. His name was removed from military records wherever possible. The Canadian forces tried to erase him, to pretend he had never existed. But in the small towns of Tweed and Brighton and Belleville, Russell Williams can never be erased. He's in the fear that remains when women hear a noise at night. He's in the locks that get checked twice before bed. He's in the knowledge that evil doesn't always look like evil, that monsters can wear uniforms and receive salutes and command respect right up until the moment they're finally caught. Colonel Russell Williams proved that the most dangerous predators are often the ones we least suspect, the ones we trust, the ones we invite into our communities and our lives without hesitation. And that might be the most disturbing lesson of all. The property at 953 Dominion Avenue in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, didn't look like much. A ramshackle pig farm on the outskirts of Vancouver, muddy and run down, with dilapidated buildings and rusting equipment scattered across several acres. The Pickton brothers, Robert and David, ran the farm with their sister Linda. They weren't wealthy, but they got by, raising pigs and occasionally hosting parties in a converted barn they called the Piggy Palace. But beneath the ordinary surface of this unremarkable farm lay secrets so dark, so horrifying, that when they finally came to light, they would shock the entire nation and raise uncomfortable questions about how such evil could flourish for so long. Robert William Pickton was an odd man, even by the admission of those who knew him. Socially awkward, poor hygiene, a high-pitched voice that seemed incongruous with his stocky frame. He never married, had few friends, and seemed most comfortable around his pigs. People who encountered him at the farm or at the Piggy Palace parties found him strange but harmless. Creepy, maybe, but not dangerous. They were catastrophically wrong. Throughout the 1990s and into the early 2000s, women began disappearing from Vancouver's downtown east side. Dozens of them, sex workers, drug addicts, Indigenous women, the most vulnerable members of society. They vanished from street corners where they had been seen the night before. They missed appointments with social workers. They stopped calling their families. And almost no one in authority seemed to care. The women of the downtown east side had been sounding the alarm for years. They warned each other about bad dates, about men who became violent, about customers who didn't bring them back. They created informal networks of protection, checking on each other, reporting when someone went missing. But the police were slow to investigate. The prevailing attitude seemed to be that these women had chosen risky lifestyles, and whatever happened to them was somehow their own fault. But the women kept disappearing. 49 women, possibly more, vanished between the early 1990s and 2001. Their names would eventually be listed on a memorial, a testament to lives dismissed and discarded: Serena Abotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Aisberry, Brenda Wolfe, Georgina Poppin, and so many others. What no one knew, what no one even suspected, was that many of these women had taken their last breath on Robert Pickton's pig farm. Pickton would cruise the downtown east side in his vehicle, looking for victims. He offered money, drugs, a place to party. Some women who went with him and survived later reported that he was rough, aggressive, that something about him felt wrong. But they were desperate, and survival sometimes means accepting rides from men who make your skin crawl. The ones who didn't survive never got to tell their stories. On the farm, Pickton had created his own private hunting ground. He killed the women he brought there, though exactly how remains unclear in many cases. Some were shot. Some were strangled. Some were beaten. What happened to their bodies afterward is even more horrifying. Pickton dismembered his victims. He processed their remains the way you would process a pig for slaughter. He had the tools, the knowledge, the facilities. He ground up body parts. He fed some remains to his pigs. He disposed of others at a rendering plant in Vancouver, where animal carcasses were processed for various industrial uses. Human remains mixed with pig remains, rendered down, transformed into products that entered the commercial supply chain. It's possible, even likely, that parts of Robert Pickton's victims ended up in consumer products. The rendering plant processed material that went into everything from cosmetics to animal feed. The thought is almost too monstrous to contemplate, but the evidence suggests it happened. For years, Pickton operated with impunity. The farm was his kingdom, and no one questioned what happened there. There were rumors, whispered warnings among the women of the downtown east side about a weird pig farmer who took women to his property and they never came back. Some women who had been to the farm and escaped reported disturbing experiences to police, but nothing was done. The investigations went nowhere. In 1997, Pickton was charged with attempted murder after a sex worker escaped from the farm, covered in blood, claiming he had tried to kill her. She had been handcuffed and stabbed, but managed to fight back and flee. Pickton's story was that she had attacked him while high on drugs. Incredibly, the charges were dismissed. The key to his handcuffs was found at the scene, but somehow Pickton walked free. 4 more years of killing followed. Finally, in February 2002, police executed a search warrant at the Pickton farm. They were actually looking for illegal firearms, but what they found was evidence of a horror beyond comprehension. In a motorhome on the property, they discovered personal belongings of missing women. In the barn and slaughterhouse, they found human remains. The property became the largest crime scene in Canadian history. Excavation of the farm took years. Forensic anthropologists sifted through soil contaminated with both human and animal remains. They found DNA evidence of 33 women on the property. Personal effects of missing women turned up in the rubble: purses, IDs, jewelry, clothing. Each discovery was another family's nightmare confirmed, another woman's fate finally known. In one of the most chilling pieces of evidence, police found Pickton's DNA mingled with the DNA of multiple victims on a dildo covered in blood. They found human remains in the freezers where Pickton stored his pork. They found skulls that had been cut in half. They found human hair and bone fragments ground up and mixed in with the soil. When Pickton was interrogated by an undercover police officer placed in his cell, he bragged about his crimes. He said he had killed 49 women and was going to make it 50, but he got sloppy. He talked about the killings like they were accomplishments, like he was proud of what he had done. Robert Pickton went to trial in 2007, charged with the murders of 6 women: Serena Abotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Aisberry, Brenda Wolfe, Georgina Poppin, and Marnie Frey. The trial was a media sensation, exposing not just Pickton's crimes, but the systemic failures that had allowed him to kill for so long. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. But justice for the other 43 women whose DNA was found on his property would never come. The Crown decided not to pursue charges for the remaining murders, citing the immense cost and length of the trial. Families were devastated. Their loved ones had been murdered, their bodies desecrated in the most horrific ways imaginable, and the man responsible would never even be charged for those crimes. The Pickton case forced Canada to confront uncomfortable truths about how society treats its most vulnerable members. If the victims had been middle-class women from the suburbs, would police have acted sooner? If they hadn't been sex workers and drug addicts, would their disappearances have generated more urgency? The answer, painfully obvious to everyone involved, was yes. In 2007, the Pickton farm was demolished. The buildings were torn down, the soil was removed, and the property was left barren. But you can't demolish memory. You can't excavate guilt. The families of the victims still live with the knowledge of what happened to their daughters, mothers, and sisters. The women of the downtown East Side still live with the knowledge that for years their warnings were ignored. Robert Pickton is currently serving his sentence in a maximum security prison in Quebec. In 2013, he was the victim of a prison attack that left him with severe head injuries. He survived, though his quality of life was reportedly diminished. Some saw it as karma. Others saw it as the violence of the prison system perpetuating more violence. But for the families of the victims, there is no satisfaction in Pickton's suffering. Nothing can bring back the women he murdered. Nothing can undo the horror of how he disposed of their bodies. Nothing can erase the years of being ignored, dismissed, and disbelieved. The pig farm at 953 Dominion Avenue no longer exists, but its legacy endures. It stands as a reminder of what happens when society decides certain lives don't matter. It's a testament to the evil that can flourish when the most vulnerable among us are left unprotected. And it's a warning that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like awkward pig farmers throwing parties in converted barns, and by the time we recognize them for what they are, it's far too late. The last time Rodney Stafford saw his daughter alive, she was walking out of her school on a sunny April afternoon, her backpack bouncing against her small shoulders. 8-year-old Victoria Elizabeth Marie Stafford called Tori by everyone who loved her. She had bright eyes and a quick smile, the kind of kid who could light up a room just by walking into it. She was in 3rd grade at Oliver Stevens Public School in Woodstock, Ontario, and that day, April 8, 2009, should have been just another ordinary day in an ordinary life. It wasn't. At 3:30 that afternoon, Tori walked out of school just like always. But this time, instead of getting on her bus or meeting her family, she encountered Terry Lynn McClintock, an 18-year-old woman wearing a Hannah Montana shirt, someone who looked safe and friendly to a trusting child. The school's security cameras captured the moment. You can see Tori walking beside McClintock, the two of them heading away from the school. Tori is looking up at this older girl, probably listening to whatever story McClintock had told to lure her away. Maybe McClintock said she had a puppy to show her. Maybe she said she needed help with something. Whatever the lie was, it worked. That footage, those last images of Tori alive and unharmed, would be played over and over in the days and weeks that followed. The entire nation would watch that little girl in her black coat walking trustingly beside her abductor, and hearts would break across the country. When Tori didn't come home that afternoon, her parents knew immediately that something was wrong. Tori was responsible. She didn't wander off. She followed rules. Rodney Stafford and Tara McDonald, Tori's mother, contacted police within hours. An Amber Alert was issued. Search parties formed. Volunteers combed through Woodstock and the surrounding areas. Tori's picture was everywhere, on television, in newspapers, on telephone poles and store windows. For 103 days, Tori's family lived in a special kind of hell, the hell of not knowing. Was she alive? Was she suffering? Was she scared? Were they searching in the right places? Every day that passed dimmed the hope a little more, but they couldn't give up. Giving up meant accepting the unacceptable. The investigation moved quickly in some ways and agonizingly slowly in others. Police identified McClintock from the security footage and brought her in for questioning. At first, she denied everything. Then, slowly, she began to talk. What she revealed was so horrific that even experienced detectives struggled to maintain their composure. McClintock confessed that she had abducted Tori at the request of her boyfriend, Michael Rafferty, a 28-year-old man with a dark sexual appetite and no conscience. Rafferty had told McClintock he wanted a young girl, and McClintock, desperate to please him, desperate to keep his attention, had complied. She had prowled around Tori's school looking for a target. She had chosen Tori because she was alone, small, vulnerable. McClintock led Tori to where Rafferty was waiting in his car. They put her in the back seat and drove. For hours, they drove with that terrified child, heading toward Mount Forest, a small community north of Woodwood. What happened during that drive is almost too painful to recount. Rafferty sexually assaulted Tori while McClintock drove. An 8-year-old girl, stolen from in front of her school, was raped in the back seat of a car by a monster while another monster helped him do it. When Rafferty was done, they needed to get rid of the witness to their crime. They stopped at a rock-cut area off a rural road. McClintock took Tori out of the car. The little girl who had been through hell already, who had endured things no child should ever endure, was still alive. Still crying for her mommy. Still hoping, maybe, that this nightmare would end and she could go home. McClintock took a claw hammer and beat Tori to death. Let that sink in for a moment. An 18-year-old woman beat an 8-year-old child to death with a hammer while the child begged for her life. They covered Tori's body with garbage bags and hid it under a rock. Then they got back in the car and drove away, leaving that little girl alone in the woods, discarded like trash. For months, Tori lay there while her parents begged for information, while volunteers searched, while the nation hoped and prayed. She was 102 kilometers from home, in a place no one thought to look. On July 19, 2009, McClintock led police to Tori's remains. The news that every parent dreads, the news that ends all hope, was delivered to Rodney Stafford and Tara McDonald. Their daughter was dead, had been dead almost since the moment she was taken. All those weeks of hoping had been for nothing. All those prayers had gone unanswered. The province of Ontario went into mourning. Thousands of people attended Tori's funeral. Many of them strangers who had been following her case, who had been hoping with her parents, who felt connected to this little girl they had never met. The grief was palpable, overwhelming. How could something like this happen? How could two people be so evil? The trials of Michael Rafferty and Terry Lynn McClintock were media circuses. Details emerged that made the crimes somehow even worse than they had first appeared. Evidence showed that Rafferty had been collecting child pornography, that his laptop was full of images of children being sexually abused. He had been planning this for a long time. Tori wasn't a random victim. She was the fulfillment of a long-held fantasy. McClintock tried to claim she had been coerced, that she was afraid of Rafferty, that she was a victim too. But the evidence told a different story. She had actively participated. She had lured Tori. She had helped restrain her. And she had delivered the fatal blows with the hammer. In a plea deal, McClintock pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and received a life sentence with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Rafferty went to trial. His defense tried to paint him as innocent, as a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the jury didn't buy it. They saw the evidence. They heard McClintock's testimony. They saw the child pornography. In May 2012, Michael Rafferty was convicted of first-degree murder, sexual assault causing bodily harm, and kidnapping. He too received a life sentence with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Justice had been served, at least in the legal sense. But for Tori's family, there is no justice that can make this right. No sentence can bring Tori back. No punishment can undo what was done to her. Rodney Stafford has become an advocate for victims' rights, channeling his grief into fighting for changes to the criminal justice system. Tara McDonald has struggled publicly with her grief, her guilt, her anger. The entire family has been shattered in ways that can never fully heal. The case led to changes in how schools handle pickup procedures. It sparked conversations about stranger danger and the importance of teaching children that not all adults can be trusted. It led to debates about the parole system and whether people convicted of murdering children should ever have the possibility of release. In 2018, the case returned to public attention when it was revealed that McClintock had been transferred from a maximum security prison to a healing lodge, a minimum security indigenous facility. The public outrage was immediate and intense. Rodney Stafford led the charge, appearing on television and in newspapers, asking how the woman who murdered his daughter with a hammer could possibly be in a healing lodge. The government eventually reversed the decision, and McClintock was returned to a secure facility. But the damage to the family was done again. They had been forced to relive the nightmare, to see McClintock's face on television, to hear people debate whether she deserved compassion or healing. Every time the case returns to public consciousness, Tori's family has to experience their loss all over again. Tori Stafford would be 23 years old now if she had lived. She might be in university. She might have a career, a partner, dreams for the future. She might have given her parents grandchildren. But all of that was stolen from her on a sunny April afternoon by two people who decided that their desires were more important than a child's life. Woodstock, Ontario is a small city where people know each other, where children are supposed to be safe, where parents send their kids to school without fear. The abduction and murder of Tori Stafford shattered that sense of security. It reminded everyone that evil can strike anywhere, that monsters don't always look like monsters, that we can never be too careful when it comes to protecting our children. Tori's grave is visited regularly by family and strangers alike. People leave flowers, stuffed animals, notes telling her she's not forgotten. Her mother has tattooed Tori's name on her body. Her father speaks her name at every opportunity, determined that she be remembered as more than just a victim, as a real girl who loved and was loved. This is what evil does. It doesn't just take one life. It ripples outward, destroying families, traumatizing communities, creating waves of pain that never fully subside. Michael Rafferty and Terry Lynn McClintock took Tori Stafford's life, but they damaged so many others in the process. They created a wound in the fabric of a community that will never fully heal. And somewhere in Canada, in two separate prisons, they serve their sentences while Tori remains forever 8 years old, forever frozen in those last moments of her life, forever the little girl in the black coat walking trustingly beside her killer. March 3rd, 2005, started as a routine day for the RCMP detachment in Mayerthorpe, Alberta. This small town of fewer than 2,000 people, about 90 miles northwest of Edmonton, was the kind of place where serious crime was rare. The officers knew most of the locals by name. They helped with traffic accidents, dealt with the occasional drunk driver, responded to domestic disputes. It was good police work in a small community, the kind of policing that builds relationships and keeps people safe. But on this particular Thursday, a routine investigation was about to turn into the worst tragedy in the modern history of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The target of the investigation was James Roscoe, a 46-year-old man with a long criminal history and a well-earned reputation as dangerous. Roscoe lived on a farm outside Mayerthorpe, and he had been on the RCMP's radar for years. He had convictions for assault, sexual assault of a minor, illegal possession of weapons, and numerous violations of court orders. He was known to hate police with a passion that bordered on pathological. He had threatened officers before. He had made it clear that he would never be taken alive. The RCMP knew James Roscoe was trouble, but they couldn't have imagined just how much trouble he would become. On March 2nd, a bailiff had attempted to repossess a truck from Roscoe's property. The bailiff was accompanied by RCMP officers, standard procedure when dealing with someone like Roscoe. When they arrived at the farm, Roscoe wasn't there, but what they found was deeply concerning. The Quonset hut on the property appeared to be set up as a marijuana grow operation, and there were signs of a significant amount of stolen property. This wasn't just a civil repossession anymore. This was a criminal investigation. The officers obtained a search warrant and began processing the scene. They called for additional support. By the evening of March 2nd, 4 young RCMP constables were stationed at the farm to guard the scene overnight and continue the investigation the next morning. Their names were Peter Sheeman, Anthony Gordon, Lionel Johnston, and Brock Myrle. The oldest was 32. The youngest was just 21. These 4 men, trained professionals serving their country, settled in for what they expected to be an uneventful night of guard duty. The farm was quiet. The evidence was secure. Everything seemed under control. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that James Roscoe had been informed about the search, and he was coming back. Roscoe had spent the night of March 2nd at a friend's house in the area. He knew the police were at his farm. He knew they had found his grow operation and his stolen property. He knew that if he was caught, he would be going to prison for a very long time, and true to his word, he had no intention of being taken alive. Instead, James Roscoe decided to take as many police officers with him as he could. In the early morning hours of March 3rd, Roscoe made his way back to his property. He was armed with a high-powered rifle. He knew the layout of his farm intimately, every building, every path, every place of concealment. The 4 RCMP officers, despite their training, were at a severe disadvantage. They were in unfamiliar territory. They were in the open, and they had no idea what was about to happen. Around 9 in the morning, a civilian who worked with the RCMP drove onto the property to deliver equipment. Constable Peter Sheeman came out to meet him. They were standing by the Quonset hut talking when shots rang out. The civilian dove for cover. Constable Sheeman went down. James Roscoe had begun his attack. What followed was a massacre. Roscoe moved through his property with deadly efficiency, hunting the officers like animals. Constable Anthony Gordon was shot next, then Constable Lionel Johnston, then Constable Brock Myrle. Each young man, each dedicated officer, each son and brother and friend was cut down by Roscoe's rifle. The civilian who had witnessed the beginning of the attack managed to escape and call for help. Within minutes, RCMP officers from across the region were racing toward Mayerthorpe, but they were too late. By the time backup arrived, all 4 constables were dead or dying. James Roscoe had shot himself, taking his own life as he had always promised he would. When the smoke cleared and the scene was secured, the full horror of what had happened became apparent. 4 RCMP officers had been murdered in cold blood. 4 families had lost sons. The RCMP had suffered its worst one-day loss of life in over a century, and the small town of Mayerthorpe was forever changed. The investigation that followed revealed the depth of Roscoe's preparation. He had been planning for a confrontation with police for years. His farm was essentially a fortified position. He had weapons stockpiled, he had ammunition, he had escape routes planned, and he had the mindset of a man with nothing to lose. It also revealed something even more troubling. Roscoe hadn't acted entirely alone. In the hours before the attack, he had contacted a local man named Sean Hennessy and asked for a ride to his property. Hennessy, who knew Roscoe well, agreed. He picked up Roscoe and drove him to the farm, knowing that police were there, knowing that Roscoe was armed, knowing that something terrible was likely to happen. Another man, Dennis Cheeseman, was also involved in transporting Roscoe. After the massacre, both Hennessy and Cheeseman were arrested and charged. In a controversial decision, they were not charged with murder. As prosecutors determined, they didn't know specifically that Roscoe intended to kill the officers. Instead, they were charged with manslaughter. Both men eventually pleaded guilty and received prison sentences. The legal proceedings did little to ease the pain of the families left behind. Peter Sheeman left behind a wife and 2 young children. Anthony Gordon was engaged to be married. Lionel Johnston had a young daughter. Brock Myrle, at just 21, had barely begun his career and his life. Each of these men had joined the RCMP to serve and protect. Each had taken an oath to put themselves in harm's way for others. And each had paid the ultimate price. The funerals for the 4 fallen officers were massive events that drew RCMP members from across Canada and around the world. Thousands of people lined the streets of Edmonton as the funeral processions passed. The nation mourned. Politicians gave speeches. Flags flew at half-mast. But for the families, the public mourning eventually ended while their private grief continued forever. The Mayerthorpe Massacre led to significant changes in RCMP procedures. Reviews were conducted. Training was enhanced. Policies about officer safety in dangerous situations were revised. The RCMP was determined that such a tragedy would never happen again. But all the policy changes in the world couldn't bring back Peter Sheeman, Anthony Gordon, Lionel Johnston, and Brock Myrtle. In Mayerthorpe itself, memorials were erected. A cairn stands near the town bearing the names of the 4 fallen officers. Every year on March 3rd, people gather to remember. Veterans of the RCMP travel to Mayerthorpe to pay their respects. The families of the fallen officers have created scholarships in their loved ones' names. They have worked to ensure that Peter, Anthony, Lionel, and Brock are remembered not just as victims, but as heroes who died in service to their country. James Roscoe's property was eventually demolished. The buildings were torn down. The land was cleared. But the memory of what happened there cannot be erased. Local residents still drive past the property and remember. RCMP officers who responded that day still carry the trauma of what they witnessed. The civilian who narrowly escaped death still lives with survivors' guilt. The Mayerthorpe Massacre stands as a stark reminder of the dangers the police officers face every day. These 4 young men went to work on a Thursday morning expecting to spend the day processing a crime scene. They had no reason to believe they wouldn't be going home to their families that night. But they encountered evil in its purest form, a man so consumed by rage and hatred that he was willing to murder 4 people just to avoid facing justice for his crimes. In the years since the massacre, the families of the fallen officers have shown remarkable strength and grace. They have channeled their grief into advocacy for officer safety. They have worked with the RCMP to improve training and procedures. They have ensured that their loved one's sacrifice was not in vain. But late at night, when the public memorials are over and the speeches have been given and the ceremonies have concluded, they still face empty chairs at the dinner table. They still reach for phones to call sons who will never answer. They still see young RCMP officers in their red serge uniforms and remember their own sons, brothers, and fathers who wore that uniform with pride. March 3, 2005, was supposed to be a routine day in Mayerthorpe, Alberta. It became the day that 4 good men lost their lives to senseless violence. It became the day that a small town's innocence was shattered. It became the day that the RCMP family was reminded that the thin blue line protecting society is maintained at an enormous cost, sometimes the ultimate cost. The town of Mayerthorpe has slowly healed over the years, but the scars remain. The RCMP continues to serve and protect, but they do so with the memory of Peter, Anthony, Lionel, and Brock always in their hearts. And in Canada, whenever police officers are killed in the line of duty, people remember Mayerthorpe, remember the price of service, and remember 4 young men who deserved so much better than the fate they received on a quiet farm outside a small Alberta town.